This is the most agile jet that I've ever flown to this point, and it's massive too. Hey there, I'm John, this is Two Brothers RC, and this is the free-wing MiG-29 Fulcrum twin 80mm with thrust vectoring. You guys begged me to fly it for years, and I finally caved and bought it. And it wasn't cheap. With the full setup on display here, the MiG-29 cost me over $1,000, which is a hefty price to pay for a single video and a jet that I'm only gonna fly once or twice a year. But you guys are totally worth it, so let's see what it's capable of by putting it through the patent-pending Two Brothers review system. We begin by looking at the Fulcrum's agility, and obviously it doesn't disappoint at all, ever. This thing is so maneuverable that it's almost unbelievable to watch, even when I'm the one flying it and making it perform. I'm not saying that I'm awesome, I'm saying that I can't believe what I'm seeing it do even when I'm the one piloting it. It's hard to reconcile what I see in the air versus how it feels on the sticks. Yes, it's a big, heavy airplane and it flies like it is, but at the same time, it doesn't. It's hard to explain, you just have to fly one of these for yourself to really understand what I'm telling you. Yes, cubic wing load, yada yada, all that fun calculator crap. What we see here is a jet that's supremely capable regardless of what a wing loading calculator might tell you. The thrust vectoring nozzles on my setup are completely gyro stabilized, making the jet almost impossible to stall so long as you push the left stick forward and don't fly it into a tree or the ground. But how does it stack up to the review metrics? Let's see. Is it prone to accelerated stalls? This is super important because I've flown some planes that are, and they're not fun. Fortunately, no, it's not going to stall while maneuvering so long as you're not slamming the elevator while you're turning it, passing our first checkpoint. Is it easy to make less nose heavy? Yeah. It's very easy to make less nose heavy. In fact, it's quite possible to make it almost tail heavy by using the rear two battery trays. The Fulcrum features 3 tray positions, one forward, one mid, one aft, and placing a pack in the mid and aft positions is enough to make it very maneuverable and very difficult to control unless you gyro stabilize the jet, passing our second checkpoint with ease. Does it take off and land without struggling? I don't know, you tell me. It very obviously has no issues taking off, balanced 40mm behind the marks. Even 25mm behind is still easy peasy lemon squeezy rotation and cleanup. Landing is a little more tricky, but it's not something that I personally found difficult. Unless you're flying in strong crosswinds, you probably won't have a problem. Probably. Gyro stabilizing the TV nozzles in all 3 axes makes the jet float in very easily, so long as you plan for a longer approach than what you might otherwise expect from a big, heavy jet like this, because it can fly at close to 10 miles an hour and easily rotates into the air again, even after touchdown if you try using the huge stabilators as air brakes. The Fulcrum passes our 3rd checkpoint. Now, does it have adequate thrust for most maneuvers? Again, you tell me. I think it does, but there might be some joker out there who thinks being able to do a quadruple backflip still means that it's underpowered. In my view, it is anything but underpowered. The new 2150 kV 80mm in-runners produce tons of thrust, but at the consequence of really pissing off your batteries if you're not careful. Again, in my view, this is not a jet that you should be buying to point a radar gun at or install GPS in. If you're trying to virtually race people with ground speed, maybe consider buying a model car and race that instead. It is fast, but even with great SMC 5900 batteries, the most that you can reasonably expect is about 130 miles an hour. Even amazing batteries can't overcome the physics of thrust versus drag. That's just how it is sometimes. The Fulcrum passes our 4th checkpoint. Now, stall recovery is easy if you're using the thrust vectoring nozzles. You don't have to gyro stabilize them, but that certainly makes a massive difference, especially as you shift the center of gravity 40 millimeters behind the marks, which is where I did most of my flying. The Fulcrum in stock form is still, for reasons that continue to baffle me, sold with a thrust line that points upward. If you get too slow with it, the jet cannot power out of a stall and it will lock the jet into high alpha because it won't have enough effective airspeed to push the nose down. And the only solution to this is to power down and let the nose fall and regain airspeed again. But if you're too low, you're boned. So I definitely recommend getting the thrust vectored version if you can afford it, because it's a critical fix to what Freewing should have fixed a long ass time ago. Since I'm flying the version of the Fulcrum that came pre-installed with thrust vectoring, we're going to go ahead and say that it passes the final checkpoint here. However, if I was flying the non-TV version that comes stock like that, then absolutely it would have failed. The MiG-29 gets a 5 out of 5 here, or a 4 out of 5 if you're one of those people flying without thrust vectoring. Flight time is another area where the Fulcrum shines. You'd think that a twin 80mm jet would destroy batteries and not give you a whole bunch of flight time, but I managed to average not just 2, 3, or 4 minutes of flight, but wait, over 5 minutes total, with SMC 6200 batteries and mixed throttle flying. Now, I know those aren't sold anymore, so the replacement would be the new 6900 HV packs, which you should have absolutely no issues hitting 5 minutes of flight with if you're not just pushing the left stick to 100% the entire time, which is not only bad practice for high voltage batteries because you're going to piss them off real good, it's also kind of missing the entire point of having a thrust vector jet that's capable of doing so much more than flying in high-speed circles. If that's your thing, I'm not knocking you, I'm just trying to explain that flight time is a function of how much you push the left stick upward. The more that stick goes up, the less the plane can stay in the air. That's the gist of it. The Fulcrum earns a 5 out of 5 here. But if you want the scientific explanation from an aeronautical engineer, like my buddy Alejandro from the channel RC Forever, drag, one of the primary forces working against an aircraft, is a parabolic curve. He says that at low speeds, aircraft suffer from a lot of drag. Consequently, they also suffer from a lot of drag at high speeds as well, and there's a sweet spot in between high and low speed flight where drag is not as much of a factor and the energy required to stay airborne is minimal. In layman's terms, and to make this easier to understand, if a jet is flying at high speeds, it requires a ton of energy to stay at that speed. If it's flying at low speed as well, it also requires a ton of energy to stay airborne. But if you're cruising around at the mid-throttle range of the stick, you should find that the jet will fly for quite a while. You can even test this yourself and notice just how well most airplanes will fly with a lot less throttle. Using less energy means that you fly longer, so if all you care about is showing off to your buddies that you got a number to appear on your GPS or radar gun, then by all means, slam that left stick to the top of the gimbal. If you want to explore the full range of the plane's capabilities, just try moving the stick down a little sometimes. We now move into the landing gear section of this review, and we're going to see a big difference in how it scored previously. While the agility and flight time of the Fulcrum are top-notch, the gear are not. This is super unfortunate too, because such a massive jet deserves a better landing gear system than this. Let's start with covering the wheels. They do work. Great! It passes this checkpoint. The wheels are hard plastic, not so great. Failing there. The wheels are attached to a very robust suspension system, which is also pretty great, passing there too. But I need to cover why it's going to fail the low maintenance checkpoint. If you get this jet, drop the gear and look at it from the front very carefully. If yours is like mine, you'll notice that the gear are pointing not straight. If you see the gear pointing outward instead of being aligned with the fuselage at a 90-degree angle, you need to take the struts off of the gear pins and file a new flat spot to force them to be aligned perfectly. This is a very heavy jet, and the wheels being misaligned will cause issues, not with the gear themselves, but with the foam that the retracts are mounted to in the fuselage. That's why it fails the low maintenance check, because I had to fix this tow out issue before I even flew the jet. I consulted again with Alejandro from the channel RC Forever, who, by any reasonable metric, would be considered a forefront expert on this jet, considering the crazy shit he's managed to pull off with it, and has also been a longtime owner who's been very vocal about the gear problems that this jet suffers from. The gear system generally works flawlessly as long as you're not a grass pilot. According to several long-term Fulcrum owners that I've talked to, this is an issue of when, not if, the foam will eventually begin to degrade from grass airfields. The Fulcrum earns a 2 out of 5 here. Moving on, we'll now cover fit and finish, which is an area that the Fulcrum will shine in again, thankfully. I know it's not listed as a metric here, but the entire plane is covered in paint. That's awesome. I wish more manufacturers would cover every part of a plane in paint instead of leaving bare foam. I know it's foam. I don't want to be reminded of it being foam when I look at it. Giving it a full paint job does make it a little heavier, but it also increases the cool factor. Now, the paint wasn't blotchy or damaged out of the box, and neither was the foam, passing these two review metrics. The hinges are all gapless, not a single foam hinge to be found on this jet, and the stabilators are full flying, which is kind of implied by the fact that I call them stabilators instead of elevators, passing yet again. In typical free-wing fashion, the Fulcrum features decals instead of stickers, and the decals all appear to adhere no matter what crazy shit I force this plane to do. The Fulcrum earns a 5 out of 5 here. We move on to our final review subject, which is avionics and lighting. On this subject, I'm pretty disappointed with the BEC, which is the power system that runs the servos and receiver, because it came stock with a 5-volt, 10-amp power system. That might be adequate for a basic setup, but for what I want to do, it's woefully inadequate. The thrust vectoring servos were simply not getting enough voltage to avoid sticking in place while I was moving the stick slowly. This is unacceptable for a plane that cost $800. I ended up buying a ZTW 15-amp BEC off of Amazon set to 6 volts to get enough voltage to the servos to make them function correctly. Yes, I did have to isolate the new BEC from the landing gear so that I wouldn't burn them up on 6 volts. I hear conflicting reports and I can't really be sure if free-wing retracts can take 6 volts, so I play it safe and run them on 5 volts if I ever upgrade the BEC to a higher voltage. I'll cover that in the upcoming mod section, but moving on to the actual review part of this section, the jet features metal servos throughout the airframe. They're not particularly precise, but they are metal, so they pass here. I was unhappy with the limited stabilator travel, so I replaced the stab servos with high-tech HS5245 MG units that you'll find linked below, which gave me more torque, way more precision, and more speed than the stock units. It's winter in North Carolina, so I can't tell you if the ESCs will overheat in summer weather, but I imagine they'll be fine considering I've flown the same ESC and motor combination in other jets in much warmer weather than this, so the Fulcrum passes the overheating checkpoint. It does contain a lighting system, and it looks correct to me in the sense that the nav lights aren't flashing, and it has a functional landing light, passing both of these metrics. This jet has what I would consider to be the absolute pinnacle of battery tray designs, with a front, mid, and rear tray system that allows you to get this thing as nose heavy, neutral, or tail heavy as you prefer. That's f***ing awesome, because I'm so sick of being forced to fly nose heavy and having to rip up my airplanes to put batteries further aft when all they had to do was give us the damned option to run it further aft if we want it to. The Fulcrum earns a 5 out of 5 here. Overall, the Fulcrum earns a 22 out of 25. If Freewing would finally take the time to fix the gear alignment issue that's been known about for years and reinforce the foam around the struts, I'd have to call it a perfect jet based on the review criteria only. For people who want the absolute maximum performance that you can get out of this jet, you do need at least 6 volts powering the servos, and you'll definitely want to replace the stab servos too. For the price of the jet, I think it's a good value, and if you follow my quick setup guide and download the setup file from our Discord server, you can have all of it done for you and you won't need to mix anything at all. Huge thanks to our channel supporters on twobrosrc.com/supporters who helped make the F-22 80, 70, 64, and upcoming SR-71 70mm videos possible. Unfortunately, I did have to buy this really expensive jet completely out of pocket, but I really appreciate you guys stepping up and helping us demonstrate these airframes for you. Special thanks goes out to our mega fans Sarasota RC Squadron, Michael Smith, Casey Gray, and JR Man. A very special thanks to our ultra fan Seahawk92, who just joined that tier. It still blows me away that you guys love what we do enough to help us fund airplanes like this. Thank you again. Before we wrap up and move on to the final section of this review, which will be the mods that I recommend and the quick setup guide, here's the AS3X Plus guides for the AR-10360T receiver that I flew the Fulcrum with. I know that's a lot of words. To use these gains, you will need a throttle to gain mix or simply copy the setup that I'm using on our Discord server. If you don't know how to set up a throttle to gain mix, check our AS3X Plus guide linked below. The thrust vectoring system requires much higher gains to be effective while artificially stabilized, so don't be afraid of those values. High thrust vectored gains can't affect the aircraft's aerodynamics until it slows down significantly, which is when the gyro stable vectoring system will basically make it unstallable if you've got thrust applied. Now, here's the mods needed to get your jet to fly like mine. Step 1. To follow my setup, you'll need an AR-10360T Plus receiver from Spectrum, plus a remote receiver from all the interference that's possible with this jet, and a channel expander from RC Light Systems so that you can set it up using 14 physical channels. Step 2. For the power system, you'll need the original 10 amp 5V BEC, and you'll also need a ZTW 15 amp BEC, which you'll then set to 6 volts, and you'll need to isolate the retracts from the 6V power system. You can do this by using a Y cable and cut the signal lead off the male plug, then run the freed signal wire for the gear to the receiver's gear signal port, and use heat shrink tubing or electrical tape to cover the remaining male portions of the Y cable to prevent any potential electrical shorts. To fix the gear tow-out issue with step 3, you need to do the following. Drop the gear, unscrew the retracts from the fuselage one at a time, undo the set screws holding the strut to the retract with a 2mm hex driver, gently as to not strip the set screws. Then use a hobby file to create a new flat spot to eliminate or minimize the tow out. Then reinstall the gear again. If you don't know how to do this, or if I'm not clear enough, hop on Discord and somebody will know, I guarantee it. Step 4. Install KMRC afterburner units. They're some of the least expensive, brightest, and adjustable units that you can buy, and they help support a small business run by a really good guy who's committed to making high-quality products. They're what we use, and I think you should consider using them too. Step 5. I highly recommend removing the blue box. Remove the ribbon connectors from the wings and fuselage, and run servo leads directly to the receiver. It does take a little longer to plug the jet in this way, but the 6V setup will prevent the blue box from powering the landing light if you leave the blue box in it. It only works with 5V. You'll power the landing light using a Freewing LED controller instead. Before we proceed with the setup here, you will need to set up your receiver's gyro to expect a aileron tail configuration, but you'll need to have your radio set to a dual elevator setup. This is so that you can disable the stabilator roll mixing if you so desire, or otherwise adjust it to your preferences. The AS3X guide, linked below, covers how to do this, and we also have a written guide on our Discord server, linked below as well, that you can ask for. Moving to the setup info, every control surface servo is set to 150 travel. I'm flying 100% rate with 50% expo for all control surfaces. Mixing this jet is complex and technical, but I'll go over the basics here. Hop on Discord if you have questions. Don't ask in the comments below, it's way too complicated to follow up with on YouTube comments. The first mix that you need is the throttle to gain curved mix. Match the points that I have on display here, fly it, and see how you like it. Then set the mix to your flap switch and add the other points that you see on screen to match. What this does: you get a gain reduction as throttle is applied. You need less gain at higher speeds. You need more gain at lower speeds, especially at landing thrust, which is where the flaps down switch positions cause the gains to spike. If you're flying on the NX-10, IX-14, or IX-20 like I am, you should put your gain channel on the left or right slider so that you can adjust it in flight with one of your fingers. Increase the gain as you slow down and do high alpha or landing for maximum stability where it matters most, or you can disable the gyro if you're a masochist and you want to see how long you can fly this jet balanced 40mm behind the marks. Good luck. I'm skipping the air brake and high G mixing. Neither of them does much and it was mostly for testing. Moving on to the steering mix, this is a curved mix that dampens the rudder stick's effectiveness at steering around the midpoint because of the narrow wheelbase the Fulcrum possesses. It's very easy to ground loop with too much steering, in other words. You still get full travel at the endpoints though. Other jets with a narrow wheelbase would benefit from this mix as well, including the F-16, F-22, J-10, etc. I put my KMRC afterburners on a curved mix so that I could control the intensity of the burner ignition point and have full control over it. This is only possible if you put the afterburner on its own channel. This is one of the channels that I used with the RC Light Systems channel expander. When you look at the setup on Discord, you'll see it listed in Servo Setup. Aileron mixing is only needed if you set up the jet the way that I recommend that you do, by programming the gyro so that it thinks it's a aileron configured aircraft while leaving the radio in the dual elevator tail type. This mix allows you to command roll through the stabilators instead of just the ailerons, giving you a lot of low speed and high speed roll authority. Steering trim is pretty self-explanatory. This mix causes the right trim switch in my IX-20 to adjust the center point of the steering servo. If I push it up, it turns right. If I push it down, it turns left. This is super useful to enable because you never need to pick the plane up and hope that you got the manual adjustment just right. And here's what you probably came to see. I set up each one of these thrust-vectored servos on a curved mix so that I could dampen them around the midpoint if I wanted to. Fortunately, this linear graft worked really well. For the two pitch servos, you need them to be in two different channels if you want to use them in roll, which I highly recommend that you do. Each one of these mixes will be a simple curved mix of -100 to +100 or vice versa, with the elevator stick, aileron stick, or rudder stick controlling the vectored thrust nozzles in that direction. By coincidence, these mixes must be active prior to trying to program the auxiliary gyro system in AS3X+. If they're not moving, the gyro can't see them and it won't know that they need to be stabilized. The AS3X+ tutorial video covers this, so be sure to check that out. That's pretty much everything that I can think of offhand. Hop on Discord and ask questions, and we'll be happy to help. Just make sure that you're asking questions that weren't already covered by the video. See you guys next week with a look at the Aeros Husky, which is way more capable than it looks.